Tonight, we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. A place woven from misty meadows, the tolling of distant chapel bells, and the unmistakable sound of someone getting accidentally whacked in the face with a pig bladder ball. Welcome, dear dreamer, to medieval Europe, that muddied, mystical mosaic of castles, cathedrals, and questionable dental hygiene. Here, strangely enough, the line between leisure and chaos was as thin as a chicken feather on a windy hill. And nowhere was that chaos more spirited than on the playing fields. If you could call a street clogged with turnips and ox carts a playing field, which, in those days, they often did. Before we start, gently press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. It's what the monks would have wanted. Close your eyes. Imagine, if you will, a peaceful English village circa 1354. The birds are chirping, someone is churning butter, and in the distance, a crowd is roaring in delight. Or pain, you're not sure. Today is the feast of St. Dunstan, patron saint of blacksmiths, ear-pulling, and vaguely economic miracles. And in celebration, the local villagers have gathered for a bit of what they called sport, and what we might call unstructured public mayhem. Because you see, sports in medieval Europe weren't about health or teamwork. They were a bubbling stew of festivity, fury, and the sheer creative resourcefulness of people who didn't have television yet. It was competition forged in mud, sweat, and a total disregard for safety guidelines. Take, for example, the wonderfully chaotic spectacle known as mob football. No one really invented mob football. It just happened, like rainfall or feudalism. Mob football was less a game and more a cross between a civic tradition and a public disturbance, played between two rival villages or neighborhoods. Teams could be 10 people or 500, depending on how many folks happened to wander over after morning ale. The ball was often made from an inflated pig's bladder, which, we admit, doesn't immediately scream fun, but when you're 700 years shy of Nintendo, you make do. The rules, surprisingly simple. 1. Get the ball to the opposing village's church door. 2. Don't die. Everything else, wrestling, tackling, bribing livestock to block the road, was fair game. The pitch would include open fields, rivers, forests, and someone's aunt's herb garden. Players would trample over market stalls, leap hedges, and occasionally come home with someone else's shoe or an entirely new understanding of pain. The game would begin with the ball being tossed into the crowd, often by a town official, or whoever hadn't had enough mead yet to care about consequences. From there, it descended gloriously into bedlam. Medieval chroniclers, bless their precise quills, recorded broken bones, lost teeth, and in one celebrated case, a stolen wheelbarrow that somehow changed the outcome of the entire match. And yet, the people loved it. Historians believe mob football served a greater purpose. It aired grievances, solidified local pride, and gave the villagers an outlet for energy that might otherwise have been spent fighting over sheep or misinterpreted glances. Village lords tried again and again to ban it. King Edward II, who reigned with a crown heavy with both jewels and mild exasperation, outlawed football in 1314, claiming that there is great noise in the city caused by hustling over large balls. He was not wrong, but much like telling a cat not to sit on medieval parchment, the decree was largely ignored. There's something charming, isn't there, in a world so muddy and unpredictable, where the shared thrill of charging through hedgerows after a squeaky leather orb could unify neighbours and knaves alike. Mob football was rugged, raw, and entirely reflective of its time. a century where entertainment meant either a wandering lute player or the sporadic chance to shin-kick someone you slightly disliked under the thin veil of sport. And as you drift deeper into stillness, picture that pig bladder ball rolling softly down a cobbled lane, lit only by twilight and the gentle flicker of candlelight from thatched windows. All around, the village settles, a few bruised, a few victorious, and the smell of roasted leeks rising in the cool air. Not all sports required bruised ribs and shouted insults through ale-foamed beards, of course. Some games were subtle, covert, almost elegant in their absurdity. But that, dear listener, is a tale for another sleepy moment. Let us drift now to a faraway English meadow, mossy and wide, where sheep blink without urgency, and the breeze smells faintly of peat smoke and brass buttons. It's a spring morning sometime in the 13th century, and despite the pastoral stillness, something truly chaotic is about to unfold. Because, and I whisper this with the utmost medieval respect, it's time for football. Not the sort of football you know now with neatly drawn lines and politely overpriced snacks. Oh no, we're talking about mob football, the unruly godparent of modern soccer and rugby, with rules fuzzier than a monk's eyebrows and a body count that would alarm even a Viking. Mob football, also known by names like Shrovetide football, or simply our dangerous little way of bonding, was a kind of town-wide roughhousing dressed as a sport. It often took place on Shrove Tuesday, just before Lent, when people knew they were about to endure 40 days without bacon or joy. So they figured, why not hurl ourselves at each other in a gloriously muddy catharsis? The game involved 2 goals, usually landmarks at opposite ends of the village. A church porch, say, or a conveniently disgraced tree. The ball was usually an inflated pig's bladder, ethically sourced from a pig who was presumably beyond caring. And the aim was to get it to your side's goal by any means necessary, and by any means we do mean it. Tripping, certainly. Grappling, mandatory. Kicking shins and biting elbows. Encouraged, or at least not discouraged. The teams could involve dozens, sometimes hundreds of participants. Essentially, every able-bodied man, and more than a few not so able-bodied men, all swarming like bees with a vendetta. There were no referees, no time limits, no standardized field. Sometimes the field involved navigating over pig pens, through taverns, across rivers, and occasionally, by tragic accident, into lakes. The ball was occasionally lost, then found weeks later in a priest turnip patch, or the rafters of a granary. Of course, injuries were not so much a risk as an inevitability. Broken bones, bruised egos, and even the occasional death were all par for the course. Monks recorded such matches with a mix of horror and bonhomie. Today, the townsmen did chase the bladder with great enthusiasm, and 2 did perish, which was less than last year, praise be, wrote one such brother Cedric, probably while icing his own ankle. It was not all madness, though. Watching from atop hay carts and thatched balconies, villagers cheered with mugs of ale and buns of questionable density. It was tradition. It was bonding. It was, in its way, breathtakingly violent community therapy. Kings and councils did try to intervene. Football, they protested, was distracting young men from worthier pursuits, such as war or sermon napping. Edward II famously banned it in 1314, declaring it a great cause of evil in the city, which, coming from a man whose hobbies included falconry and political paranoia, is saying something. Enforcement was tricky, however, given that most of the law enforcers were also former participants, quietly nursing old shin wounds and fond memories. mob football highlighted something rather sweet, in a terrifyingly bruised sort of way. It showed how people, when stirred by a common love of mud and competitive chaos, could come together to shout, chase, tackle, and more or less trample each other with affection. If medieval Europe was sometimes haunted by plague and poverty, it was also, blessedly, haunted by the sound of laughter, groaning, and someone shouting, "Not the face." It is perhaps comforting to know that as humans, long before we developed spreadsheets and socks that match, we were already familiar with the joy of completely unregulated sports. Football today may come with referees, video replays, and scarves with suspiciously synthetic fibers. But long ago, it blossomed from the collective madness of hamlets and highland villages, where the rules were loose, and so were most people's teeth. So as the twilight tucks itself behind the damp thatch of yesteryear, let's leave the din of medieval shoving behind. The game is winding down. Mud-caked players limp home amid the faint jingling of belt buckles and the comforting aroma of someone's post-game leek stew. And as the moon casts its silver grin across that ancient field, we tiptoe onward to a sport somehow even more chaotic, a sport with sticks, strategy, and the occasional scandalous pig. Nestled between whispering oak groves and ivy-covered keeps, where the scent of mead and moss hung lazily in the air, the noble leisure pursuits of knights took on forms that were surprisingly aggressive. Welcome, dear listener, to the oddly romantic, and slightly bruised world of pas d'armes, a sport that was somehow equal parts poetry, pageantry, and light bludgeoning to the torso. Now, let your thoughts drift. Picture the cool breath of a medieval dawn. A silver mist curls like a ribbon over a muddy road, and along that road a knight stands in full shining armor, blocking the way like a very polite toll booth covered in decorative metal. His sword gleams. His moustache is waxed into two immovable crescents of seriousness, and beside him, a scroll, a challenge, a declaration of participation in the grand tradition of pas d'armes, or literally, passage of arms, not to be confused with passage of arms in the fighting for your life sense, though. Well, it often ended up being that too. You see, during the height of chivalric culture, roughly the 14th and 15th centuries, knights were beginning to feel a bit unused. Warfare had taken a bureaucratic turn. Armor was expensive, and lords preferred peace treaties over dramatic horseback somersaults. So what's a knight to do when times go soft? Invent gentlemanly combat at roadside checkpoints, of course. In pas d'armes, a knight, or sometimes a posse of them, would station themselves at a crossroads or a bridge. Then they'd announce loudly and with scrolls that no passerby could continue unless they accepted a duel. Now, of course, this didn't mean the average peasant on a beet cart would be challenged. That would be unsporting. No, the targets were other knights and nobles. Participation was expected, lest rumours circulate that Sir Lionel of Fogsmouth fled from a polite fencing match in front of Lady Rosalind of Perpetual Swooning. These public declarations were filled with flowery language, roses and metaphors, velvet banners flying in the breeze, all wrapping around what was essentially, "Stop here and fight me if you fancy being fashionable." Occasionally, it was the ladies who inspired these contests. A knight might declare a pas d'armes in honor of an unattainable lady, offering to take on all comers until someone could best him, and thus win the honor of, say, waving at her from afar. Love in the Middle Ages, dear sleeper, often involved a great deal of chainmail and bruised ribs. Now, to ensure things didn't spiral into full-out brawls, these encounters had rules. They were like NFL playbooks, but with more French and occasional sonnets. There were agreed upon weapons: lance, sword, maybe a flanged mace if it was Tuesday. Victory might mean 3 solid hits, or knocking someone off their horse in the fewest attempts, or simply looking the most majestic while parrying. And yes, injuries occurred. Teeth were sometimes lost, armor dented, pride routinely shattered like a dropped tea tray. But within the oddly romantic world of pas d'armes, these skirmishes were not simply battle. They were performance art. Shakespeare meets WWE, if you will. Some of the more theatrical nights went further. One famous pas d'armes involved 29 gentlemen guarding a bridge, announcing that no man could cross unless he had kissed the mistress of his heart in the last 3 days. If he hadn't, he must wait there in reflection or joust for forgiveness. The rules were unclear, the drama was high, and the bridge traffic absolutely nightmarish. Of course, one could refuse a duel, but doing so meant leaving your spurs behind. Yes, actual spurs, as a token of your shame. Essentially, the medieval version of writing "I chickened out" on your social media profile. Curiously, and quite adorably, some of these events included logistics teams. Families sent food, tailors patched armor, scribes documented every jab and jabble. It was like a Renaissance fair with occasional fractures, and while it all sounds delightfully silly to us now, at the time, it was a way to maintain nightly relevancy and to make dramatic entrances with very jangly footwear. As night falls over our imagined tournament field, the jousting lances now resting quietly beside tents of silk, and the champions nursing their bruised everything with warm ale and misplaced sonnets, we drift onward. There's yet more to explore in this parade of peculiar pastimes. If you're still awake, gently tuck your chin into your cloak and let the soothing sound of marching boots carry you toward the next curious chapter of medieval sporting delight, where horses ran in places they probably shouldn't have. Picture this. It's a damp spring afternoon in a mossy English village sometime in the 12th century. Thatched roofs drip softly from the morning rain, wood smoke curls from crooked chimneys, and someone's grandmother is yelling something that sounds suspiciously like "get the pig bladder," which means only one thing: it's time for a friendly game of mob football. Now, if the phrase mob football sounds charmingly chaotic, congratulations, it absolutely was. Imagine soccer, but with no actual rules, goals set miles apart, sometimes literal miles, and a ball that looked suspiciously like an old animal organ. Because it probably was. Add in the entire population of 2 neighbouring towns, including the blacksmith, a drunk monk, and 3 small dogs, and remove anything resembling safety, structure, or referees with whistles. What remains is not so much a sport as a roaming stampede of enthusiasm, bruises, and civic pride. These matches often took place on Shrove Tuesday, which conveniently arrived just before Lent, making it a glorious final explosion of sinful festivity before the stretch of moderation. And what could be more festive than tackling your neighbour face first into a cabbage cart? Mob football was spectacularly unbridled. The ball, typically an inflated animal bladder or a sturdy leather sack, would be tossed into the air to start the match, at which point several hundred villagers would immediately hurl themselves toward it like very muddy bees to honey. The only instruction was to get the ball to a designated place, sometimes the church porch, sometimes a riverbank, sometimes just anywhere in East Dunstable, all while overcoming just a few slight obstacles such as fences, livestock, and your cousin Thomas swinging a frying pan. There were no team uniforms, because everyone knew who was from where, and besides, the blood, sweat, and eels tended to stain everything into a uniform brown-grey hue by the end. But here's where it gets dreamily medieval. No one ever really remembers who won. Victory in mob football was less about points and more about feelings, about bonding, bruising, and chasing a bladder over hedges and through gardens, while noblemen looked on in vague bemusement from horseback, tapping their noses and whispering things like, well, that's one way to express community spirit. Of course, authorities did try to ban the game, multiple times. Kings issued solemn decrees condemning it as rowdy, disruptive, and, quite critically, not archery practice. Archery, you see, was the enforced national pastime, intended to keep yeomen strong for war. But let's be honest, how often do you get to tackle the parish accountant into a puddle of questionable depth? Still, mob football persisted. Not because it was especially well organised, oh no, but because it tapped into something deep and timeless, a communal joy, a need to run and shout and wrestle someone from a hamlet 2 valleys over, mostly because they pronounce milk with a suspicious accent. And though it sometimes did get a touch overly enthusiastic, there are records of property damage, bruised egos, and at least one tax collector who simply disappeared mid-match. Most villages considered it a beloved ritual. Parents passed it down to their children, who would one day stoically take an elbow to the chin in the name of tradition. Whispers of this ancient sport echo today. It lives on in the terrifyingly spirited events of Ashbourne in Derbyshire, where the Shrovetide football match still takes place, a direct ancestral throwback to the medieval mob games of long ago. Thousands show up. The goals are still 3 miles apart. The ball is still lovingly chaotic, and naps are still strongly advised afterward. So as we rest under this soft quilt of muddy nostalgia, it's easy to see that even in their roughest games, medieval folks found a strange serenity in the frenzy. Something beautifully bruised, something gloriously, glandular from the bladder up. And as you let your mind drift like a leather ball down a sleepy village lane, you might begin to sense that medieval sports weren't just brutal. They were oddly poetic, in the way only a game without rules or mercy can be. Now hush, dear listener. Close your eyes gently as we journey next into a game less rooted in mud and more in something even stranger. Birds, nobles, and very sharp beaks. Close your eyes, dear listener, and picture a soft English meadow, somewhere between a drizzle and a fog, where the grass is damp and the air smells faintly of sheep and centuries-old mischief. The year is, well, it hardly matters. Let's just say it's comfortably medieval, a time when knights jousted, nobles plotted, and peasants, oh the peasants, found delight in kicking each other directly in the shins. Yes, welcome to the elegant world of medieval shin-kicking, a sport so refined it was sometimes referred to as the English martial art, though that might have been someone's idea of a joke. Picture 2 stocky men, most likely named something like Wulfric or Greg, each gripping the other by the collar, their legs thick with straw stuffed down their trousers for protection. This is not a whimsy. Participants in shin-kicking contests would often pack their pant legs with hay to soften the blows. Though, much like using a feather to block a sword, this worked only marginally. The goal? Well, the goal was simple and beautiful. Kick the other person's shins until they either fall over or begin to re-evaluate all their life decisions. Matches were overseen by a referee known as a stickler, which is where we get the modern term. Yes, the next time someone corrects your grammar at a dinner party, you may thank the respected tradition of shin-kicking. Shin kicking was a staple event at the Cotswold Olympics. Yes, with a K. A real festival of rustic sports established in the early 1600s by a Robert Dover. Though 1600s may stretch us just past the core medieval period, the tradition itself was well rooted by then. Dover's grand event included cudgel fighting, wrestling, and of course, the aforementioned shin buffet. But don't worry, it wasn't all bruise and bother. The event also involved pipe music, dancing, and moderate amounts of mead, which helped everyone feel slightly less bad about having deeply violated someone else's tibias. Now, lest we think England had the patent on peasant pandemonium, let's drift quietly through the mist and over the channel to France, where people were also busy injuring each other for recreation, just more flair, less straw. One such pastime was the joyous and completely non-dignified shul, a medieval ancestor of rugby, which could best be described as a combination of football, a tug of war, and a pub brawl conducted in an open field. Shul often involved entire villages. Men, and occasionally the bolder sort of goose, would square, off with a wooden ball the size of a small child, attempting to run it to a designated target. The rules were both elaborate and entirely unenforced. Tripping, punching, and a fair amount of shouting were not only allowed, but encouraged. The outcome mattered less than the spectacle, and the sight of grandmothers waving shawls from windows added to the cheer. And should your medieval dreamscape take us even further east, into the lush forests of Germany, we'd find Bauernfechten, peasant fencing. Contrary to what the name implies, this was not an elegant duel with slim blades and musings on honor. No, listeners, this was far more homespun. It involved hefty sticks, strong arms, and a willingness to walk home without any teeth. Matches could start as demonstrations of strength, or as a solution to that age-old dispute, whose cow actually nibbled whose cabbage. The gear included thick gloves, sturdy boots, and whatever courage a man could borrow from ale. Still, despite all this clatter and bruise, these sports were communal. They forged bonds, gave structure to festivals. For a peasant in the fields, the yearly shin-kicking tournament was at once a test of toughness and a celebration of being just tough enough to keep going. Plus, if you lost, you could always limp home with dignity. And perhaps that's the tender soul of this chapter. Beneath the cracked shins and splintered sticks was a world craving entertainment, ritual, and a good-natured wallop to the leg. Now, close your eyes and let your mind linger on the soft fog of that English field, the clump of boots on turf, the laughter from the crowd, the whistling of a reed pipe as two men decide who will inherit the title of shin-kicking champion of Lower Biddlesworth. As the sounds of medieval merriment fade into the warm amber haze of twilight, let us gently wander toward another strange and sleepy tradition, one where the dangers aren't to your shins, but to your dignity and your chickens. Now let us drift ever so gently into the dew-wrapped meadows of old England, where the buttercups bloom, the sheep nibble endlessly, and villagers prepare to hurl themselves shin first into deeply questionable sporting decisions. Yes, tonight, we tiptoe into the world of shin-kicking, a sport as literal as it is ill-advised. Picture it, the early 17th century in the rolling hills of Gloucestershire, but the roots stretch deeper, perhaps whispering from the shadows of the medieval centuries. The event, the Cotswold Olympic Games, not to be confused with the other Olympics involving less bruising and more coordination. Among events like cudgeling, wrestling, and cheese rolling, yes, that's a story for another yawn, shin-kicking held a place of pride, or at the very least, a place of widespread limping. The rules, if one can call them that, were simple and suspiciously lacking in mercy. Two brave souls, or dare we say, two men whose common sense had briefly wandered off, would face each other. They'd grab one another by the shoulders or collars, because heaven forbid anyone lose dignity mid-kick, and commence to kick each other in the shins until the other surrendered or collapsed in discomfort. Victory wasn't just about pain endurance, but about technique. Though that might be generous, this was more cabbage than chess. Now you may wonder, as your eyelids droop pleasurably, who invented this? Was it a rogue squire with too much time and not enough reading material? Perhaps a farmer in search of meaning and bruises? No one knows for certain, though some suggest it began as a test of toughness among manual labourers, a playful way to prove who had the heartiest shins, the most loyal boots, and the fewest plans for tomorrow's harvest. Wit and sarcasm aside, there were indeed rules. Namely, shoes must be stuffed with straw. You see, historically, contestants filled their heavy farm boots with handfuls of hay, like packing a sleepy sandwich for war. This was mercifully a safety measure, medieval shin protection couture, if you will. Of course, some did not follow this rule. There are murmurs, no whispers, of competitors secretly weighing down their boots with iron, stones, or harder bits of countryside. If caught, they were disqualified, though one suspects the more immediate punishment was delivered by the other participant's foot. And referees? Why, yes. It wouldn't be a proper British event without regulation. The sport often featured a referee called a stickler, a name that survives today in our modern language to describe someone obsessed with rules. This particular stickler didn't wear stripes or carry a whistle. No, the medieval model likely wore spare bandages and a weary expression, watching as two grown men groaned into foot-to-shin combat beneath the watchful eyes of bored sheep and bemused children. But take note, gentle dreamer, that shin-kicking may have had deeper meaning. According to some, the sport symbolized the tension between tradition and the changing times. In the 17th century, Puritans disapproved of sports on Sundays, seeing these rougher amusements as distractions from holiness. So naturally, the English responded by kicking each other more enthusiastically. Rebellion, after all, comes in many forms. Some debate theology, others use their knees. Shin kicking, while humorous in retrospect and entirely regrettable in execution, reminds us that medieval sports were not just pastimes, they were expressions of strength, community, and comedy, like a Monty Python sketch that accidentally bruised your tibia. Though the sport faded in and out of popularity over the centuries, it still makes appearances in modern festivals. These days, thankfully, it's far more symbolic. Foam padding is used, medics are nearby, and reputation, not hospital stays, is the typical consequence of defeat. So as you settle, snuggled into your pillow fortress, listening to the hush of imagined breezes over grassy English fields, spare a moment for the villagers of yesteryear. Hardened by toil and turnips, yet still finding time to kick friends directly in the legs for sport. Let us now wander softly, from bruised shins to bigger battlegrounds, because up ahead lies a different kind of sport, one that involves armor, horses, and a surprising number of broken chairs. Drift now, dear listener, into the hush of a summer dawn in 13th century France. The sky is milk blue, the grass is damp with dew, and somewhere in the distance, a trumpet announces the beginning of a most regal form of targeted head trauma, the jousting, the clinking, clattering, innkeeper bankrupting crown jewel of medieval sports, less of a hobby and more of an occupational hazard for minor nobility. This armoured pageantry was what happened when knights decided that war wasn't quite dangerous enough. Why not sharpen their resumes and splinter a few lances while they're at it? To experience a proper joust is to witness both elegance and impending dental emergencies in slow motion. Two fully armoured men on horseback, each horse, it should be said, itself draped in roughly 40 pounds of expensive fabric and another 200 pounds of moral support, would charge at one another like polite battering rams. The goal? To break your lance on your opponent's shield, or better yet, unhorse your rival. Bonus points if you did both while keeping your stylish batch of feathers intact. Surely nothing serenely says, "I come from the higher classes," like a high-speed collision in a codpiece. But fear not, gentle listener. Although jousting could be spectacularly fatal, it had its share of rules. Sure, sometimes those rules varied from region to region and were enforced by umpiring nobles who may or may not have had wine for breakfast. But they existed. The tournament field had a wooden divider called a tilt. Yes, just like the thing people say when their pinball machine gets angry. And it kept horses from colliding while their riders aimed their lances with razor-sharp decorum. Jousting began as training for war. Early medieval knights needed practice stabbing each other from horses, and no amount of stretching would suffice. So they invented the melee, chaotic, unstructured mock battles where every knight for himself swung freely, and heralds kept score by who stayed conscious. Eventually, someone bright said, "What if we did this, but with a predictable schedule and snacks for the audience?" Thus, the tournament, and more showy, head-on matches, evolved. By the High Middle Ages, these events began to resemble the stuff of bedtime fantasy. Tents made of silk, trumpets ringing through barley-swayed fields, and dainty noblewomen watching from balconies, fanning themselves in subtle excitement every time someone almost lost a helmet or, say, an arm. And let us not forget the accents of chivalry, the guiding code that supposedly compelled knights to be gallant, court the pious, and never hit below the metaphorical and literal belt. In theory, one could win not just honor, but also scarves tied by charming maidens who definitely hadn't lost bets on who would ride better. Now, under all that poetry, was a kernel of very real danger. Jousting injuries were common, and not the sort of injuries one could simply soak in a warm bath. King Henry II of France, you may driftily recall, famously perished in 1559 after a splintered lance went straight through his helmet and into his eye. It is, I regret to report, difficult to see that as a win. Still, the joust was a spectacle, tied in ribbon by the pageantry of nobility. By the late medieval period, it had become a tool for politics and status. Descendants of the famed knightly class lined up in personalized armor, tailored to flatter their calf muscles, while common folks watched with turkey legs in hand, rooting for their local lord the same way we root for people in spandex capes today. Even the horses earned names and prestige. Some were so well trained they could perform pirouettes mid-battle. Imagine that, dancing into combat while wearing 1,000 pounds of fluted steel. Grace under crushing pressure indeed. And yet, as the sun set on jousting's golden age, the sport faced decline. Gunpowder made it rather outdated to stab people from a horse when you could just shoot them from a hedge. By the 17th century, jousts were relics, less sport and more historical reenactment with extra plumes. Still, in our dreamy slumber, we can imagine the shine of the armor, the creak of saddles, and the cheers of a crowd transfixed by a thundering dance of honor and ego. It's like Formula One, but with more feathers and fewer sponsors. Let us ride gently onward now. For while the knights may have traded their lances for legends, there were others, less pedigreed perhaps, who found sport not in pageantry, but in perilously muddy pastimes played on foot, with all the diplomacy of a tavern argument. And so, softly, we drift toward the curious chaos of what the villagers got up to when no one was watching. If you're snuggled into bed tonight, limbs safe beneath the covers and neighbourly disputes settled with nothing more than overgrown hedges and passive-aggressive glances, congratulations. You've successfully avoided being drafted into a medieval football match. Because tonight, dear listener, we drift into the chaotic, muddy, and gloriously unrefereed world of medieval mob football. A sport so spirited, it made peace treaties look like weekend picnics. Now, to call it football is a bit like calling a thunderstorm a mild drizzle. The term football in medieval Europe was less about organised teams and more about two entire villages charging at each other across miles of countryside, all while chasing a vaguely ball-shaped object and nursing centuries-old grievances. The ball, by the way, was sometimes made of pig bladder. Yes, you heard that right. An inflated pig bladder. Nothing says team spirit quite like smacking a cousin-in-law across the shins while sprinting beside a semi-deflated balloon of former swine. And yet, the pig bladder was always up for the challenge. Tough, surprisingly bouncy, and light enough to be flung from one villager to another like a medieval frisbee with consequences. There were, you'll be relieved to know, hardly any actual rules. The basic concept was tantalizingly simple. Get the ball to the opposing village's designated marker, perhaps a tree stump, a pub door, or old Gerald's wheelbarrow, and you win eternal undisturbed bragging rights until the next spring. Kick it, throw it, carry it, smuggle it beneath your tunic. There were no fouls because there was no referee. If the goal was beyond a ditch, through a river, or past a herd of confused grazing cows, all the better. They didn't call it a contact sport, they called it Tuesday. And while it may sound delightfully rustic, it was not without its drama. Reports from the time affectionately describe broken limbs, molars cheerfully donated to roadside hedges, and the occasional enthusiastic goat joining the scrum. That's not even including the enthusiastic monks who would occasionally leap in with holy zeal and surprising lung capacity. In the year 1314, King Edward II had the audacity to notice this enthusiastic village-to-village chaos and decided he'd had enough. In an official proclamation, he forbade the play of football in London on account of the great noise caused by hustling over large balls. One can only imagine the royal sleeplessness that birthed this decree. Perhaps the Queen had finally snapped after losing yet another window to a flying pig bladder. Not that anyone listened. The game would persist across centuries under different names and even more colourful injuries. In some parts of England, it became known as Shrovetide football, traditionally played on the Tuesday before Lent, a time of forgiveness, reflection, and a bit of that village-wide shin-kicking we've come to love. In one such game in Ashbourne, two teams, the Upards and the Downards, still play with goals set 3 miles apart. That's right, 3 miles. And the ball, no longer pig-based, you'll be reassured to know, is a hefty, hand-painted treasure that disappears into crowds like a magician's rabbit, and occasionally into the river, which becomes a sort of volunteer water slide. But the beauty was not in victory, it was in participation, in grandmothers cheering from windows with ladles, in dogs joyfully barking alongside muddy teenagers, in the town cobbler defending his flower bed with a broom, and the fury of 1,000 leaflets. Medieval football wasn't just sport, it was theatre, It was a collective exhale of winter's weariness, a chance to run, laugh, tackle the vicar by accident, and wake up the next morning with bruises and stories, and hopefully, both shoes. As the moon peeks over our imaginary village tonight, lighting up the misty fields and gently trampled shrubbery, we tuck away our imaginary pig bladders and let the cheering fade into the lavender twilight. Close your eyes now, and let the last echoes of medieval footfalls drift you closer to sleep as we tiptoe toward a rather curious sport that swapped the open field for something a little more projectiled. Because next, we'll be unearthing a pastime involving feathers, fireplaces, and the rather ill-fated fate of our feathered friends. But for now, rest easy. No one's chasing you across a 3-mile marshland with nothing but a bladder and a dream. As twilight stretched its lavender limbs across a sleepy medieval meadow, the distinct sound of horseshoes striking earth echoed from a wooden enclosure wrapped in pennants. The air was rich with the scent of trampled grass, roasting meat, and social anxiety. For tonight, friend, we enter the splendidly dramatic world of jousting, that noble demonstration of chivalry, ego, and excellent helmet hair. Imagine a long field, lined with nobles in their finest frowns, and peasants, with what we'll generously call sandwiches from the 1300s. At the center, a wooden barrier, called a tilt, divides two equine-powered missiles, each mounted by a knight, each measuring his success by his ability to launch another grown man into orbit. It was structured mayhem with a dash of courtly romance and a surprising amount of splinter-related injuries. Now, before you picture knights charging in with mortal fury, remember, jousting, for most of its popularity, was less about actual death and more about theatrically avoiding it. It's what the medieval world called our sport, and what medieval mothers called bar, regrettable decision-making. In case you're wondering about the rules, well, they were a bit like your dreams, fuzzy, idealistic, and ever-changing depending on how much ale was involved. A proper joust required wooden lances designed to break on impact, called rebated lances. Yet, sometimes the ends were just sharp enough to remind you wide teeth were optional in the Middle Ages. The goal? To match speed, precision, and raw stubbornness, aiming your lance at the opponent's shield or chest. Points were awarded for breaking your own lance without breaking your own ribs. Unhorsing the other knight was seen as the highest honor, and possibly grounds for a very awkward post-tournament dinner. Fashion also played an essential part. Knights donned elaborate armor, polished enough to reflect every setting sun and occasional existential crisis. Their helmets, called great helms, offered all the aerodynamics of a bucket and the visibility of a broom closet. But they looked the part, gleaming, stylized, and often personalized with crests, fans, or curious animal metaphors. One memorable record tells of a knight who bore a golden cabbage on his plume, a bold aesthetic that historians still haven't quite decoded. Jousting wasn't just for sport. No, it served political and romantic functions too. It was a venue for catching the eye of a favorite lady, impressing a potential patron, or alternatively, flattening one's opponent so thoroughly that bards would sing parodies for weeks. Some knights became famous across kingdoms. They were the medieval equivalent of pop stars, minus the social media, and plus the armor chafing. One famous knight, Geoffroy de Charny, famously wrote a book on chivalry, while also regularly attending jousts without dying, which was then considered a rare and prestigious skill. His guide to knightly virtue suggested that a true knight sought honor in noble combat, and presumably also a good dentist. Of course, the most prestigious jousts were tournaments, grand multi-day affairs sponsored by kings, dukes, and that one uncle who inherited unexpectedly. These were like your county fair, if your county fair had a daily schedule of blunt force trauma and a roast swan buffet. Spectators came from afar, some to bet gold, most to bet gossip. And yes, ladies would often toss favours, ribbons, flowers, or embroidered tokens to their chosen champions, who would then try to survive the next round using our old friend, adrenaline and face guards. It's worth remembering, however, that behind the spectacle loomed a deeper truth. Jousting was dangerous. More than one knight ended their career by flying too enthusiastically into a fence post. One such dramatic tale is that of King Henry II of France, who jousted in 1559 and took a lance splinter to the eye, a detail no bedtime story ever needed, but there it is, softly hiding in history's overstuffed closet. And yet, for all the risk, the sport persisted. There was something magnetic in the pageantry, the thunder of hooves, the nobility of flinging oneself at another in pursuit of glory. It was physical poetry, violent, dusty poetry. But then again, so is most of history. Let the sound of hooves trotting into memory soothe you now, as helmets clink and dewdrops settle onto the fields of France. Lanterns are being lit across the tournament ground, casting soft gold across banners that sway like sleep itself. And as the night deepens and the crowd drifts homeward, we turn gently from the tilt yard toward a quieter pastime, one involving villages, feasts, and a rather confusing game played with sticks and inflated pig bladders. Let's drift now, not through woodlands or castles, but onto a muddy field edged with brambles and confusion, where the cheers of peasants echo through the morning mist, and someone's grandmother is hurling a turnip at a team from the neighbouring village. Welcome, dear dreamer, to medieval football, a sport, in the loosest possible interpretation of the word, that made very few people rich and quite a few extremely concussed. Now, to call it football may stir visions of green stadiums, numbered jerseys, and crisply mowed lines. Wipe that image clean. This was more chaotic bladder chase while screaming, unless anything FIFA might sign off on. In its earliest incarnations across 12th and 13th century Europe, especially on the rainy streets of Britain and the rolling hills of France, football looked like a village-wide brawl with occasional kicking. The ball, if we dare honour it so, was often an inflated pig's bladder, a glossy, squeaky orb of animal innards, wobbling tragically between players' muddy boots and occasionally being thrown like a cursed offering into a crowd of startled ducks. There were rarely goalposts. Instead, the objective was charmingly ambiguous. Get the bladder to some agreed-upon place, often a church door miles away, and try to do so without accidental manslaughter. Everyone played, local bakers, herd boys, hardened knights home from crusades who hadn't had a decent scuffle in weeks. There were no team uniforms, so games often became confusing affairs of who hit whom. But, oh, what joy they brought. The most notable feature of medieval football was its sheer lawlessness. There were no referees, no penalties. The only rule, rather generously observed, small knives were discouraged, not banned, just discouraged. That tells you everything you need to know. Historians report matches involving hundreds of players. Sometimes entire towns marched one direction together, the pig bladder held aloft like a soggy crown jewel, while the other town's players bided time behind hedgerows and sheep carts waiting for an ambush. Eye gouging, a minor nuisance. Broken arms, part of the charm. One 14th century proclamation in London attempted to outlaw the game entirely on the grounds that it caused great noise in the city, and many evils may arise therefrom. Indeed, but try as kings and mayors might to ban it, and try they did with increasing exasperation, the lure of this primitive pastime was irresistible. There is something universally tempting about shouting, running full tilt at Kevin from the next village, and toppling into thistles while still technically playing a sport. Not all medieval football was chaos, of course, in a few monasteries. Once again, proving that even the most serene of monks could long for a little neck-level mayhem. More organized games took shape, but even these events, played within cloistered courtyards, could end in bruised robes and sheepish apologies. The weather played its part too. In the cobbled streets of England, with its damp winters and slipperier morals, the pig bladder would often fall apart halfway through the game. This never ended the match. On the contrary, it gave the players a bonus challenge. Make your way to victory armed only with fragments of the sacred bladder, held like sacred relics or deflated hopes. We might chuckle, lying here, nestled in the folds of bedtime. But perhaps the real secret of medieval football is that it wasn't really about the football at all. It was about togetherness, identity, and the simple, roaring delight of shared absurdity. Picture it now. All those cloak-clad villagers, streaked with mud, laughing despite lost teeth, chasing a squeaky bladder toward the setting sun of another medieval Monday. And while today's football might be cleaner, slicker, and somewhat less piggy, there's a part of us, deep in our dreaming brains, that still longs to run barefoot across a muddy field, shoulder to shoulder with smiling strangers, toward a finish line no one quite remembers. Now hush. The moon is rising over the village green, and far in the distance, you can just hear the faint and joyful squeal of a pig bladder, airborne once again. Let's take one more cozy breath and slip gently onward. For waiting just ahead is something even wilder than football, a game involving spears, horses, and the dubious wisdom of charging directly at each other. If you'd been strolling lazily along a medieval riverbank on a drowsy summer's afternoon, perhaps humming a Gregorian chant remix and sniffing the sweet scent of damp moss and distant cheese, you might be startled by the sudden splash of a knight tumbling backwards into the water, his pride soaking faster than his tunic. Welcome, gentle dream wanderer, to the tranquil insanity of water jousting. Yes, water jousting. Picture it. Two robust gentlemen, sometimes armored, sometimes regrettably shirtless, standing on narrow wooden platforms mounted onto the bows of boats, each with a long lance and a questionable plan. The boats would be rowed slowly toward one another, usually by villagers who were either eager to help or just bribed with leftover bread. Then, with all the speed of a boulder in molasses, the duel would commence. Now, if this sounds ridiculous, it was. It was also immensely popular, particularly in the sun-drenched towns of southern France during the later Middle Ages, when people apparently required both pageantry and hydration in their public amusements, known locally as joutes nautiques. These watery faux combats were part sport, part spectacle, and part unintentional bath. The rules were simple enough. Knock your opponent off his platform into the murk before he did the same to you. Points were optional. Style was mandatory. Bonus admiration if you could fall with dramatic flair. Flailing arms, a loud splash, possibly a goose honking in approval. It was an oddly graceful contest, despite resembling a very, very early version of a reality show gone charmingly wrong. The jousters rarely suffered serious injuries. After all, the water made for a padded landing, and dignity, unlike bones, can heal slowly over time. In the town of Set, which still hosts annual water jousting festivals to this day, records from the 17th century, a bit post-medieval, but we're dozing at the borders of time here, describe glorious tournaments featuring nobles, town champions, and occasionally overconfident local fishmongers. Earlier, in the medieval period, similar events were held along the Rhône and Saône rivers, and though records are sparse, illustrations show men in tunics brandishing lances atop low-slung boats, their eyebrows arched in what we can only describe as aquatic hubris. Of course, things didn't always go swimmingly. Imagine missing your strike, staggering forward, and simply plopping into the water like a stone in a puddle. Or, worse still, imagine both jousters falling off at the same time, which provided great fun for the spectators and an awkward moment of soggy camaraderie for the soggy duelists. One can only admire the mutual nods of damp diplomacy exchanged mid-dunk. Unlike most medieval sports, water jousting was gentler, more performance than punishment. While other games risked broken limbs and higher dental bills, the worst hazards here were water up the nose and the occasional duck-related mishap. It was the Middle Ages' equivalent of a synchronized splash competition, complete with local fanfare and floating drama. And the costumes. Oh, the costumes. Knights might wear their house colours or special tunics adorned with family crests, dragons, or, for the more whimsical, perhaps a turnip with a sword. It's hard to tell precisely what stylized vegetable duels looked like, but the records emoji will just have to suffice. Crowds would gather beneath fluttering banners, vendors hawking roasted chestnuts, mulled wine, or dried figs the consistency of medieval shoe leather. Music played, flutes, tambourines, the occasional hurdy-gurdy grinding softly in the breeze. Laughter rippled like the river itself. There was something oddly utopian about it all. Unlike the more savage pastimes we've drifted through on this twilight journey, no pigs were catapulted, no geese were flung. Just people, gravity, and some boats drifting lazily toward destiny. Sometimes, the most delightful sports in history weren't the ones about domination, but about demonstration, a sort of floating ballet of balance and blunders. So if your dreams ever take you sailing along a quiet medieval waterway, don't be surprised to see two men in tights, wobbling on planks, bravely charging toward an inevitable sploosh. Somewhere between absurdity and art, they are keeping an age-old tradition alive, with each noble splash an awkward paddle back to shore. Let the ripples quiet now and float gently toward the next page in our moonlit playbook of peculiar pastimes. For in the distance, a new arena awaits, forged not in water, but in walls. Let us drift now into the misty glens of medieval Scotland, where the air smells faintly of peat smoke and poetic stubbornness. Here, amid moss-covered stones and grouchy weather that couldn't decide between rain and more rain, rural clans enjoyed a set of sporting pastimes so oddly noble and bizarre that they still echo through kilt festivals today. Welcome to the Highland Games, where might met mud, and men competed over who could throw a log the least practically. Of course, the Highland Games have evolved into a grand cultural celebration, complete with bagpipes, shortbread, and the occasional escapee sheep. But wind the tartan clock back to the Middle Ages, and you're greeted with something that was part training session for clan warriors, part community spectacle, and part excuse to avoid watching someone churn butter. These games were less about medals and more about measuring manly usefulness in the eyes of both one's laird. and one sweetheart. The crown jewel, and possibly the most eyebrow-raising of Highland competitions, was the caber toss. This was not a dainty baton to be twirled or a javelin to spear dragons. No, lad. A caber was essentially a young tree in the form of a slightly trimmed pine log, often about 19 feet long and weighing over 100 pounds. The aim? To hoist the timber upright, stagger into a dead run, emphasis on dead, and heave the log end over end so that it landed with a forward flip, and landed perfectly vertical. Like a very confused gymnast's slight miscalculation. Contrary to all logic, the caber wasn't thrown for distance, but for accuracy. Imagine trying to flip a telephone pole onto its feet with gentle flair and a touch of grace. Judges determined success based on whether the caber landed in the coveted 12 o'clock position, straight ahead of the tosser's charge. If it flopped awkwardly to the side, one's clan pride might sag slightly, though one's spine might already have done the same. Then there was stone putting, the less glamorized ancestor of modern shot put, using no polished metal sphere, but instead whatever rock looked assertive enough to make your enemies consider alternative life choices. Participants would hoist and hurl these natural weights as far as their limbs, or their lumbar discs, could manage. The technique varied from person to person. Some spun elegantly like a medieval ballerina with boundary issues. Others relied on what might generously be called gusto and poor decisions. Weight for height was another popular trial. Picture a man swinging a 56-pound weight backward between his legs. Yes, exactly like that. And then attempting to launch it up and over a tall bar, praying to avoid concussions and unintended poetry. The bar was raised progressively until eventually either physics or the competitors admitted defeat. It was sport. It was drama. It was a subtle test of whether your ancestors had used your great-great-grandfather for lifting carts or carrying gossip home from the village pub. Yet, amid all this scenic muscle flinging, the Highland Games were never just about brute strength. They were also about mastery and form. There were foot races over absurd landscapes, where Highlanders dashed barefoot up hills steeper than a cathedral roof. Folk wrestled by gripping each other's kilts, an intimate art form known as backhold wrestling, which resembled two philosophies wrapped in woven wool, determined to tip the other into existential humility. And in case you're wondering, yes, they did consider using sheep at one point, not as projectiles, but more as reluctant bystanders. Sheep were known to mill about the field during competitions, chewing cud and speculating on human eccentricities. Their bleary-eyed gazes, philosophically unimpressed, lent the games a rustic and slightly judgmental air. You have not truly performed a caber toss until you've done it under the unflinching stare of a sheep who's seen it all. All these events, as rough-edged as they were, served a dual purpose: to display physical skill worthy of ancient bards, and to bring communities together in a kind of tartan-tinged jubilation. Victories were toasted with mead or rough ale, and failures were gently teased, sometimes for decades. It's said that memory is long in the Highlands, especially for the man who couldn't clear the weight over the bar and instead took it squarely on his bonnet. And as bagpipes wail like wistful banshees in the distance, we leave this mossy glade of sporting enthusiasm behind, with kilts swirling and toes muddy. Ahead lies yet another curious pastime, one with less tossing of timber and more thwacking of shins. Let your mind amble on, dear dreamer, toward the clatter of wooden sticks and the oddly ceremonial violence of something called medieval stick fighting. Shh! Listen, can you hear it? The soft rustle of chainmail, the gentle whinnies of war horses winding down for the night, and the distant sound of a lute playing slightly out of tune. Ah yes, we've drifted into the rarefied air of medieval tournaments. But not the nightly pageants seen in romantic films. No. Tonight, we slumber through the dust, the dents, and the delicate diplomacy of the tournament melee. A sport so brutal, it sometimes ended with the winner inheriting the loser's boots, horse, and teeth. Let's nestle into our cloaks and lean in a little closer to the flickering torchlight of the 12th century. Forget the polite jousting of today's Renaissance fairs, with their choreographed tilts and safety waivers. The tournament melee, or just melee if the scribe was feeling lazy, was a full-on mock battle. Imagine a battlefield, complete with teams of armoured knights, weapons blunted as a courtesy but still quite smashy, all charging at each other with the unrestrained joy of noblemen who rarely had employee evaluations. Melees were, in theory, a kind of playful military exercise, a way to practice for real warfare while enjoying the company of one's fellow aristocrats and occasionally clobbering them with great enthusiasm. Lords would gather by the hundreds. Knights in shining and not so shining armour would divide into teams, and the whole affair might sprawl across many muddy acres. The goal? Survive, and ideally, come home with a few enemy knights as prisoners. Because ransoms, you see, paid quite well. These events were not small affairs. Entire towns would be consumed by the spectacle. Picture peasants selling hot mead, minstrels tuning their lutes beside public latrines, and merchants hawking Sir Bertrand the Brutal novelty mugs. It was all very festive, so long as one didn't end up unconscious in a hedgerow with a dented helmet and a missing codpiece. You see, unlike formal duels which had rules, referees, and honour points, the melee was gloriously chaotic. It was less sportsmanship and more smash whatever isn't wearing your colours. Armour dented like overcooked pie crust. Horses veered. Lords shouted for glory, or at least for property rights. All beneath a sky thick with the smell of churned earth and medieval pride. And yes, sometimes they called a time out to stop for wine and a roasted pigeon. It wasn't that rare to see a knight take a short break under a tree, dust off his surcoat, and politely wait for his favoured nemesis to pass within striking range. Such was the decorum of the day. Now, don't let the chaos fool you. Melees were not just mayhem in iron. They had a social structure, a pecking order, a subtle strategy. In fact, many young knights used them as networking events. Slamming into someone with a blunted lance, just your average icebreaker. Capturing and ransoming the heir to a barony. That's what we might now call climbing the corporate ladder. The spoils of victory could be generous. A captured knight owed you not just gold, but often his armour, his horse, the decorative clasp on his cloak, essentially anything you claimed before he regained consciousness. Which is partly why knights took such care in carving their family crests into their shields. It wasn't just about lineage. It was so your captor could invoice the correct accounting office. By the 13th century, melees began to tame themselves, partly due to religious pressure. It turned out pummeling other Christians for sport caused subtle doctrinal concerns, and partly because so many nobles kept losing uncles and horses in what was supposed to be a game. Eventually, jousts, tidy and predictable as chess pieces, grew in popularity. Safer, easier to film for the ballads, and less likely to leave someone with a halberd wedged in their armpit. So as we lull our minds to rest under a velvet sky studded with medieval stars, let's tip our mental helmets to those gallant, if slightly bruised knights of the melee, fighters of imaginary wars, players of a sport where the bruises were real, but the goal was only glory gold, and a good story to mumble over your mead. Now, close your eyes as we drift through the muddled silence, beyond the babble of standard bearers and the clanging of dreams. Just ahead, our next tale tiptoes forth of medieval foot races, field games, and a peasant's chance to outrun shame. Let us drift now into a world of armoured clinks and the lyrical clang of lances, a dreamscape where gallant knights chase glory, and occasionally their own teeth, across muddy grounds. Yes, dear listener, wrapped in blankets and twilight, tonight we tiptoe into the realm of the joust. Not quite the elegant knightly pageant modern bedtime stories promise, but a rather soul-rattling sport with more splinters than chivalry. Now, when one thinks of the joust, sleepy books and happier fairy tales might summon up courtly knights with flowing banners, galloping gracefully beneath the benevolent gaze of royalty. And while that wasn't entirely wrong, it omits a few crunchy details. For instance, the medieval joust could be described, quite accurately, as two very ambitious tin cans hurtling at each other atop very unsure horses, all for the slim chance of impressing a lady, or better yet, a landowner with inheritance. By the 13th century, the makeshift violence of local melees, where knights rumbled in glorious chaos that resembled a medieval version of a pub brawl with horses, began to give way to the gloriously theatrical one-on-one joust. Here was a sport that distilled the madness of warfare into brief, bone-jarring moments on a field decorated with flags, flowers, and the occasional flying helm. Mounted on massive destriers, horses that likely had no idea what they were signing up for, knights would hurtle down the lists with lances as long as misfortune. These were not the featherweight props of Hollywood dreams, oh no. The average jousting lance weighed around 15 pounds and if properly aimed, could de-helmet or de-horse even the most seasoned knight, sometimes both at once. But let's not rush ahead of ourselves like an overzealous squire. Before the joust even began, there was the matter of the armour, a metal onion of layers, buckles, and indignity, requiring at least 2 other people, several mumbled prayers, and a moderately cooperative knight to assemble. A fully armoured knight might weigh nearly 100 pounds more than usual, an excellent excuse to avoid stairs. Once suited and mounted, with lances set and helpfully blunt, though blunt in the Middle Ages still meant lethal if enthusiastic, the knights would take their places at either end of the tilt barrier. This long wooden fence separated the two combatants and helped ensure they ran at each other, rather than veering off course into the Queen's luncheon. A good tilt, that barrier. Then came the trumpet fanfare, a flurry of cheers, and thundering hooves. In 3 to 5 passes, each knight hurled himself forward, hoping not necessarily to hit the opponent, but to strike with enough flair, accuracy, and absence of personal injury to win the admiration of the crowd. Points were awarded for various noble stunts, such as shattering your lance upon your opponent's shield, a skill rather like trying to poke a galloping rock. Bonus points if your opponent was dramatically unhorsed, which delighted the spectators and dismayed the spine. And oh, the variety of results. Triumphs worthy of song, defeats worthy of a good long nap with leeches involved, clashes that ended with knights bowing respectfully, and others that ended with cart rides followed by muttered regrets from medieval physicians, whose most confident diagnosis was usually, "There's a lot of blood." But let us not mistake these events for mere violence. They were magnificent pageants, as much about social stature as shattered shields. A knight who jousted well might attract the attention of noble patrons, generous lords, and maidenly sighs. This wasn't just sport, it was resume building. Of course, there were those who took it too far. The infamous French knight Geoffroy de Charny, for instance, suggested that a true joust should only end when someone was either unhorsed or, well, deceased. He was known amongst his peers as both gallant and utterly terrifying. Despite, or perhaps because of, its bloody spectacle, the tournament joust grew into one of Europe's most beloved and most artistically depicted martial sports. Kings jousted, princes paraded. Manuscripts glowed with gilded knights charging toward fate and hay bales. Eventually, though, the realness of the sport, those inconvenient concussions and shattered clavicles, gave way to slightly safer versions, and the modern reenactment was born, where lances shatter on cue and heroes rise unbruised. But for now, as the dust of the tilt settles and our knight sits dazed but proudly upright with half a lance lodged in his helmet visor, we shall glide gently onward to a world where sport met mischief with far fewer rules and considerably more feathers. Ah, dear dreamer, if there were ever a sport that looked like a medieval fairy tale and felt like a medieval car crash, it was jousting. That iconic spectacle where heavily armored men charge full tilt at each other on horseback, lances extended like oversized toothpicks of destiny, aiming squarely for a collision that was both noble and, let's be honest, wildly ill-advised. Tonight, as the moon hangs like a silver pendant above the battlements of your imagination, we delve into the world of knights, tilting yards, and a pastime that was equal parts aristocratic theatre and orthopedic nightmare. Now, contrary to romanticized portrayals, jousting was less about rescuing princesses and more about demonstrating your ability to remain upright while wearing 80 pounds of steel and being hit in the chest by a literal tree branch. The origins of jousting go back to the 11th century, when knights, fresh off their morning porridge and existential angst, decided that mock combat was a fun way to show off for the local nobility. Early tournaments were nothing short of bloodbaths. Picture this: hundreds of over-eager young men galloping chaotically across open fields, swinging weapons with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for toddlers with spaghetti. But by the 13th century, jousting had evolved into something far more elegant, or at least more organized. Dedicated tournament grounds were built, called lists, complete with a dividing barrier known as the tilt. This separated riders as they charged, ideally preventing the horses from colliding, though not always successfully. Turns out, muscle-bound stallions don't read architectural blueprints. The goal of a joust was to hit your opponent with your lance squarely enough to unseat them or break your lance upon their armor. Ideally both. Points were awarded based on precision, impact, and dramatic flair. Think of it as Olympic fencing, but on horseback, and everyone is dressed like a cast-iron bathtub. And it wasn't merely a boys' game. Jousting tournaments were grand events, attended by queens, squires, troubadours, and thoroughly bored chickens who'd wandered in from the local market. Nobility paid a high price for the pomp, and the events were dripping in pageantry. Heralds announced each night with trumpet fanfare and embroidered banners, while noblewomen tossed silk ribbons or kerchiefs as tokens of affection, although some likely just did it because they had nothing better to do, and the embroidery class had been cancelled. Of course, even in its more refined forms, jousting remained astonishingly dangerous. One particularly well-documented accident involved King Henry II of France, who, in 1559, took a splinter of lance straight through the eye during a friendly match, resulting not only in his untimely death, but also the sudden banishment of the phrase friendly match from French vocabulary for at least a fortnight. And yet, the allure persisted. For medieval knights with a flair for drama and a stubborn disregard for health insurance, jousting was the ultimate test of manly valor and fashionable bruising. Armourers would spend months crafting custom plate armour, designed not just for protection, but flair, with visors shaped like snarling beasts, crests like miniature castles, and codpieces so unnecessarily armoured they probably interfered with local weather patterns. Tournaments could last for days, nestled among banquets, dances, and contests of poetic insult, which was also a popular pre-joust warm-up. Nothing like calling your opponent a boiled turnip with delusions of knighthood to build tension before violently colliding at 16 miles per hour. Even the horses got their share of the drama. Trained tournament steeds were prized like gold and dressed accordingly. Imagine horses bedecked in embroidered caparisons the length of a wedding veil, shuffling side to side with the equine equivalent of "Why is this my life?" in their eyes. But while jousting was certainly violent, it wasn't only about force. Successful knights knew how to aim, when to pivot, and exactly how to fall with panache. It was a deadly dance, yes, but a dance all the same. And for those watching from under the shaded canopies with pear tarts in hand, it was simply exhilarating, a perfect blend of theatre, strategy, and mild to severe concussion. As jousting began to wane in the late medieval period, replaced by less impaling forms of entertainment, such as watching 4-hour morality plays or debating theology with frightening seriousness, its legacy lived on in storybooks and dusty museum exhibits. Somewhere deep in your dreams, a knight still rides, slowly, carefully, given the armor's poor ventilation. And as we drift further into sleep, let us saddle up and tilt ever so gently toward our next curious crusade through medieval sport. The unpredictable, unregulated, and utterly unsupervised mayhem of mob football. Let us drift now to a quiet field, perhaps near the edge of a forest, where the grass sways gently and arrows whistle softly through the air. Tonight, our thoughts settle on the noble and deceptively dangerous sport of medieval archery, a pastime that married battlefield utility with a surprisingly competitive spirit. Archery was less about brute force and more about precision, patience, and occasionally not getting accidentally skewered during Sunday practice. Despite what your imagination might suggest, medieval archery contests were not held in echoing castles or grand colosseums. No, they were much humbler affairs. Picture a village green, a handful of hay bales, and a collection of men dressed in wool cloaks that haven't seen soap since last Michaelmas. They line up, bows in hand, quivers at their hips, squinting heroically at targets that seem both very far away and suspiciously like recycled turnip sacks. Clearly, high-definition optics were still several hundred years off. Archery was one of those curious medieval activities that managed to be both elegant and lethal. Like ballroom dancing, if the waltz involved flinging pointy sticks at each other. For the average medieval Englishman, however, the longbow was less a fashion statement and more of a legal obligation. In fact, under King Edward III, all men were required by law to practice archery on Sundays. Skipping practice in favour of, say, getting some rest or attending church too attentively was frowned upon. The king, you see, was terribly worried about what would happen if France popped in unexpectedly with a war. This obsessive dedication to target practice wasn't just about sport, of course. It doubled as national defense. After all, a well-aimed longbow could pierce armor, ruin a knight's entire day, and provide much-needed plot development in most medieval battles. A particularly competent archer could loose 6 to 12 arrows in a minute. That's faster than most people can untangle their shoelaces. But away from the battlefield, competitive archery had its own rhythm. Local feasts and celebrations often hosted archery tournaments. Think of them as the medieval version of a pub trivia night, but with more hay bales and fewer questions about 1980s pop music. Villagers would gather to watch contestants shoot at a mark, often a tiny black spot painted precariously on a white board, and cheer them on with raucous enthusiasm. Ale would be poured, songs would be sung, and inevitably, there'd be that one fellow who overshot his target and accidentally sent an arrow clomping into a nearby chicken. Interestingly, the term clout archery was coined in this era, a style where archers aimed not at upright targets, but at a small flag placed flat in the ground over vast distances. Picture people squinting into a grassy expanse, loosing arrows into what was essentially a random patch of meadow. Most of the arrows missed the mark, of course, but the superior archer, the one blessed by skill, wind, and mild stubbornness, would have the satisfaction of hitting the flag dead on, or at least somewhere respectably nearby, like the adjacent cow. Marksmen were lauded, toasted with spiced wine, and perhaps even given a goose or two as a reward. A goose being the official currency of celebratory animal prizes during the Middle Ages, ranking just above small piglet and slightly below entire roasted ox. And yet, for all the charm of the village archery tournament, accidental injury was never fully off the table. Targets were not always well marked, safety lines did not exist, and occasionally, a spectator wandering between targets might find themselves in sudden and unexpected possession of an arrow. This is why some of the more forward-thinking villages began asking local friars to bless the field before competitions began. Not so much for divine accuracy, but to reduce divine liability. Still, for those watching from a safe distance, archery had an oddly serene rhythm. The snap of a bowstring, the hush as a shaft flew, the dull thud of an arrow striking slightly to the left of its intended mark, followed by merry heckling from friends. It was, in its own way, a dreamy sort of pastime, war-trained artistry recast as peacetime sport, and the longbow, loyal and unimpressed, stood by for it all, dignified and stoic, like a wooden cat with trust issues. So as we quietly wander from the archery fields, past ale-fueled boasting and mildly bruised bystanders, let us tiptoe towards the next curious gathering, where strength was measured not by arrow, but by hand. For soon we enter the dainty world of medieval tug-of-war, which was naturally anything but dainty. There are sports, and then there are medieval sports, which is to say, games people invented to make boredom bleed, quite literally. Let us wander now into the hushed morning mist of rural England, somewhere soft between legend and soggy turnip field, where a time-honoured tradition awaited with all the subtlety of a wooden club, to the kneecap. This, dear dreamer, is the tale of that most poetic of pastimes, shin-kicking. Yes, that's the whole sport. Kicking each other in the shins until someone falls down, gives up, or retires to reconsider their life decisions over a pint of warm ale. It may sound like something invented by a rowdy group of shepherds starved for entertainment. And you wouldn't be far off. Shin-kicking, or as it was more nobly known in certain circles, the English martial art, has existed since at least the early 1600s, which is frankly impressive, considering how few sports begin with a handshake and end with someone limping. But before we picture brutish folk aimlessly booting each other under the moonlight, it's worth knowing that shin kicking was part of a larger event called the Cotswold Olympic Games, a boisterous, merry mix of athletic pursuits and good-natured bruising, dating back to the reign of James I, held in a not-so-modest meadow in Gloucestershire. The games were founded by one Robert Dover, a man with both a flair for celebration and an unusual tolerance for minor fractures. The event featured leaping, wrestling, cudgel fighting, and our charming main event, a test of honour, pain tolerance, and unusually strong sock seams. The rules, such as they were elegantly simple. You and your opponent would face each other, grip one another's shoulders or collars, to foster both balance and meaningful eye contact, and then proceed to take turns attempting to sweep the other off their feet by booting them squarely in the shins. The goal wasn't just injury, but tactical imbalance. Think of it less as violence and more as aggressive persuasion with your feet. Contestants weren't completely without defense. In a show of medieval mercy, or perhaps fashion-forward armor, players were allowed to stuff their trousers with straw for padding. So if you're picturing two people looking like overfilled scarecrows having a very public disagreement, you're not wrong. The rhythms of the game must have been almost musical. A thud, a grunt, the rustle of straw, a polite yelp, and then the slow, dignified collapse of a man trying, and failing, to stay upright with his dignity intact. The winner was whichever shin survived longer. Now, as absurd as this all may sound, shin kicking was, and occasionally still is, taken quite seriously in some parts. It required real skill, balance, stamina, tolerance for pain, and perhaps just a dash of madness, like a minimalist ballet, but with significantly more limping and less applause. The Cotswold Games, along with shin kicking, saw a revival in the 20th and 21st centuries as a quaint and questionable part of British heritage. Today, it's largely performed for cheerful audiences, often alongside tug-of-war or wife-carrying competitions, which tells you a lot about the British definition of fun. And yet, as strange and battered as it sounds, there's an oddly cozy charm to shin kicking. It was never meant to be cruel. Like most folk sports of the medieval age, from cheese rolling to mob football, it sprang from community, mischief, and the age-old human desire to find amusement using whatever limbs weren't already injured. There's a kind of innocence in it, isn't there? In a world before video streams and glow-in-the-dark sneakers, people gathered in fields, teased gravity, and went home a little bruised, but feeling oddly victorious. And perhaps the true prize wasn't shin supremacy, but the story you could tell afterward from your bench at the local tavern. One sore leg propped up, tankard in hand, and a grin beneath your bruised pride. Now, let's allow those shins to rest, wrapped in warm linens and forgiveness. For though lower limbs have suffered for sport, the higher mysteries of medieval merrymaking still call to us from misty hedgerows and smoky hearths. Drift now into the hush of an older world where the next marvel awaits, a contest not of legs, but of lungs and lungs alone. Let's drift now into the plush, mossy corners of the 17th and 18th centuries. Yes, technically, the tail end of the medieval period had passed, but let's not split hairs just yet. The mood is candlelit, the fires crackle quietly in noble halls, and the noblemen, restless and emboldened by mead, have decided that the perfect way to spend an evening is to launch foxes into the air. Yes, fox tossing. That was the name of the game. Now, before you worry about the animals or your dreams tonight, let's take 2 steps back to understand this curious sport, and then perhaps 2 steps to the side in case of incoming wildlife. Fox tossing, Fuchsprellen in German, was a courtly pastime popular among European nobles, particularly in Saxony and parts of Austria during the 17th century. And yes, it is exactly what it sounds like. Courtyard arenas were built, guests donned their fanciest feathers, and pairs of players would hold opposite ends of a long cloth or sling-like device. Into this sling, a live fox would be released, or, on particularly exuberant days, a badger, a wildcat, or the occasional angry goose. The goal: to hoist the animal high into the air with a combined upward jerk of the cloth, ideally before the animal leapt or bit anyone. It was a game of timing, coordination, and complete lack of modern animal rights sensibilities. The festivities were often part of grand carnival events. Imagine powdered wigs bobbing with excitement, violinists serenading confused barn owls, laughter echoing through castle walls, interrupted occasionally by an airborne fox yelp and an aristocrat's startled, "Oh heavens, it's coming back." Foxes, for their part, were generally very against the activity. Participants were advised to stand firm, brace well, and keep an eye on their partners. Coordination was crucial. If one tosser yanked too soon and the other not at all, well, let's just say slippered toes might get nibbled, and someone would need a new pair of breeches. There were points of a sort, based on how high the fox ascended. Records tell of animals hurled up to 20 feet into the sky. That's about the height of your average 3-story daydream. One famous event was held by Augustus II the Strong, Elector of Saxony, King of Poland, a man known for both his political entanglements and his prodigious physical strength. Apparently less well known for subtlety, Augustus hosted an event where over 600 animals were flung skyward for his amusement. He quite fancied fox tossing, as did his court. Some of the participants reportedly wore masks to protect their faces, but others simply let fate and fur collide as they may. It was, in many ways, less a sport than a grand muddy mess. We might wrinkle our sleepy brows at such a pastime now, but within the layered damask and powdered pomposity, there was a kind of gloomy symbolism too, an echo of an age tilted towards spectacle, hierarchy, and occasionally flying woodland creatures. Eventually, fox tossing faded into obsolescence. As the Enlightenment dawned, animal cruelty gradually became frowned upon, and the foxes of Europe presumably sighed with deep vulpine relief. And while the sport itself is long gone, its memory reminds us that leisure, like fashion, has had some very odd seasons. Today's yoga classes and pickleball courts must look tame, perhaps laughably so, to the powdered participants of Fuchsprellen. Just imagine explaining dodgeball to an 18th century duchess. You gather in a gymnasium, no candlelight, and throw large leather balls at each other's faces until one of you cries or is declared victorious. She'd quiver her fan and politely inquire whether it included geese. History, as ever, contains multitudes, and sometimes those multitudes are airborne. So as we settle more deeply into our pillows, and the memory of leaping foxes begins to soften into dream fog, let's prepare to turn the page toward another curious game. One that involves a ball, no proper rules, and the occasional poetic riot on a feast day. Let us drift now to the open fields of medieval tournaments, where chivalry wore a sharp suit of armour, splinters flew like springtime petals, and fashion occasionally got in the way of safety. Tonight, dear sleeper, we ride slowly into the world of jousting. Ah, jousting, that most gallant and glorified of knightly pursuits, the sport that transformed a perfectly calm field into a dramatic thunderdome of trotting bravado. And yet, beneath the trumpet blasts and fluttering banners, it was often more headache than heroics. Imagine the scene. Crowds gathered under linen canopies, fine ladies fanning themselves as they perched delicately on cushions, and men squinting into the sun, trying to look interested. Heralds pranced about, announcing names as grand as Sir Geoffrey of the Gilded Gauntlet, or Sir Cedric, the punctual. At the heart of the spectacle rode two armoured knights, encased in metal from toe to tiny nostril vent, charging at each other atop horses who were, let's be honest, not entirely thrilled with the situation. The goal was simple. Break your wooden lance on your opponent's shield, or better yet, knock him straight off his steed. Think medieval sumo wrestling, but with faster animals and more splinters. A well-placed hit might win you glory, a silk ribbon from a noblewoman, or just a trip to the apothecary for yet another poultice. Of course, jousting had rules. Very elaborate, very official-looking rules written in medieval scribble, likely interpreted differently depending on how much mead everyone had consumed. There was a designated scoring system. 1 point for breaking your lance, 2 for hitting the body, and 3 if your opponent kissed the dirt. No points were awarded for impressively timed witticisms shouted just before impact. And while jousts were fantastically theatrical, they were not without risk. Helmets could fly off, teeth could become suggestions, and lances, though designed to shatter, sometimes refused to cooperate, instead delivering a rather permanent form of discouragement. But injuries were only part of the fun. The true danger of the joust? Ego. Nothing wounded a knight so deeply as being unhorsed in front of Lady Marian, of the unreadable expression. A single poorly aimed charge could ripple through the court gossip mill within minutes, leaving one's valour questioned and dinner invitations mysteriously missing. To soften the blow, literally, helmets took on increasingly ornate forms. Some looked like snarling lions. Others featured little golden wings or absurdly large plumes, as if jousting were really an avant-garde runway show. No one is certain if aerodynamic design was considered, but given the number of feathers involved, that's unlikely. And then there were the lances themselves. These weren't your everyday pointy sticks. Oh no. Tournament lances were specially made to break on impact, their tips designed to shatter safely, or at least that was the idea. The more polite term was coronal, a blunt metal end shaped like a small crown, presumably so that if you were going to be flattened, it would feel at least royally so. The best part about jousting? The pageantry. Knights rode in under banners bearing curious slogans and family symbols, like a stag leaping over a turnip or a flaming goose above a tower. Coat of arms design wasn't exactly a disciplined science back then. One unlucky noble even bore a chicken clutching a sword. He lost frequently, but was remembered fondly. This sport, as brutal and bruising as it could be, was deeply loved. It was where nobility got to act out tales of Arthurian valour, while quietly hoping nothing important got broken, like their collarbone. It was the medieval answer to reality television, and served as both entertainment and political theatre. Marriages were whispered about in the crowd. Alliances began with shared throws of ale-soaked handkerchiefs. And victory, that was the realm of ballads. And while many knights jousted for glory, others did so just to impress a noble crowd, or because their squire had already unpacked all the armor, and it seemed rude not to. But as twilight settles on our imaginary field and the clinking of armor turns into drowsy humming, we leave our knights where they belong, paused mid-canter, lances lowered, plumes aflutter. Next, let us tiptoe toward a sport that required less steel, and considerably more hitting sticks. If you tiptoe softly now past the swaying branches and whispering cloisters, you might hear it, the sound of not quite silent shouting, of shuffling sandals, and an occasional dulcet thwack. But don't worry, dear dreamer, it's not a medieval riot. It's simply the monks engaging in what might best be described as holy horsing around. Welcome to the quietest battlefield in medieval Europe, the monastery. Now, when we think of monks, we tend to picture tranquil figures in brown robes, perhaps scribbling away at illuminated manuscripts or nodding off during a long psalm. And yes, they did a lot of praying and fasting and very intense debating about whether or not fish counts as meat, depending on the angle. But monks were also, how shall we put this delicately, men with energy and boredom, and far too many hours between matins and vespers. So in the quiet cracks between sacred duties, some monasteries developed their own peculiar versions of games and contests. Did they involve goats? Sometimes. Did they involve wrestling next to the cloisters? Occasionally. Were the abbots pleased? Almost never. Which naturally made it all the more exciting. One such pastime was a curious kind of monastic mock battle that tiptoed the absolute thinnest line between exercise and excommunication. Here's how it may have looked, drifting out from the mists of an 11th century English priory. The setting: a damp stone courtyard. Weather slightly drizzly always. Two teams of monks, let's call them Team Benedict and Team Cuthbert, stand facing one another in loose formations, each side armed with wooden staves or sometimes broom handles. Let's be honest, they borrowed props from the janitorium. There was no ball, no score, and certainly no rule book, though Brother Thomas was always trying to write one. No upper body contact, he'd shout, before lunging mercilessly at Brother Elfred with all the upper body contact he could muster. The goal: gentle domination, which, in practical terms, meant lovingly whacking the other team until one side gave up or leaned gently against a column and declared they were having a spiritual vision, just to catch their breath. Some monks soberly defended the activity as exercise, an edifying way to keep the flesh in good order for the soul's benefit. Others thought it was, essentially, paganism with robes. But since the rule of St. Benedict didn't explicitly forbid coordinated staff dueling, the tradition lingered in some abbeys, especially those far from the gaze of archbishops, and doubly so if the abbot had a sense of humour or bad eyesight. Other friendly competitions flourished within cloistered walls. Some involved feats of memory, like who could recite the Psalms backwards. Others were quieter, like seeing who could go the longest without speaking. Essentially, a war of stubborn silence, marked by frequent flared nostrils and passive-aggressive humming. But back to the mock battles. It must be said, the monks took their preparation quite seriously. Some fasted beforehand, citing spiritual clarity, though it may have been more about achieving peak agility in their sandals. Robes were cinched, rules were loosely agreed upon and then immediately ignored. And once the battle began, well, woe betide the monk who forgot his defensive footwork. To the outside world, these contests might have seemed oddly out of place. Gentlemen of God playing at war. But perhaps the monks were simply finding ways to channel human energy into harmless absurdity. Better a bruised shin than a bruised ego born from theological arguments. Of course, not every monk approved. Some sternly condemned the sport, citing broken vases, injured knees, and a mysterious incident involving Brother Bertram and a cabbage. The cabbage affair was never fully explained, though it lived on in monastic folklore and occasional satirical woodcuts. Eventually, as the centuries wore on and monastic discipline tightened, and possibly the broom handles got confiscated, these mock battles faded out. But the image of a line of woolen-robed men facing off in solemn silliness remains oddly comforting, a quiet reminder that even those devoted to silence still needed space to laugh, to play, and to get hit in the knee with a gently wielded stick. So if you ever find yourself in a quiet garden at dusk and you see the flicker of shadows dancing with broomsticks, don't be alarmed. It might just be a memory replaying itself under the stars. Now, sleep tight and drift with me toward a curious village where sports weren't merely games, but superstitions in motion. Picture it, a rolling English meadow tucked between two hunched hills, puffed up like pillows. The year is somewhere between definitely medieval and please don't ask for specifics, and the air smells faintly of sheep, smoke, and impending injury. Welcome, dear dreamer, to the languid chaos of mob football, not to be confused with anything organized, polite, or remotely safe. Now, don't let the name fool you. Mob football is to modern soccer what a tavern brawl is to an elegant waltz. It was a tempest of limbs, leather, and local grievances, where kicking the ball was optional and kicking the players was, well, practically mandatory. Imagine hundreds of villagers, from rosy-cheeked bakers to grumpy blacksmiths, charging across miles of fields, over hedgerows, through streams, and occasionally through someone's kitchen. You see, there were no teams so much as mutual understandings, or perhaps grudges, between participants. The goalposts, often a pair of distant pubs, or in less ambitious cases, two standing stones with a disgruntled cow tied to one. The ball, typically pig's bladder, inflated and lovingly stitched until the poor thing resembled something spherical. It was flung into the throng with all the solemnity of a royal decree, after which, well, things got lively. Local records, scratched into parchment by slightly shell-shocked scribes, tell of lads and lasses sprinting 5 miles, tackling each other with affection only slightly more aggressive than a bear hug. The rules were simple. Get the ball to the goal by any means short of outright murder. Though there were always a few grey areas. Serious injury was considered a minor inconvenience. Riots, an enthusiastic misunderstanding. Of course, not everyone was charmed by the spectacle. Kings and bishops shook their heads furiously. In 1314, the Lord Mayor of London issued a statement that could be summarised as, "Stop charging through people's markets, you lunatics." And yet, ban it as they might, you just couldn't keep the townsfolk from their beloved chaos. Mob football had something sacred to it, a boisterous, bruising celebration of spring, of community, of all pent-up winter frustrations released like a sneeze into open air. It was tradition, and tradition, especially medieval tradition, was only slightly less immovable than an ox in a muddy lane. Interestingly, our sleepy stroll through mob football reveals a striking contradiction. This rowdy pastime had an unexpectedly healing side. In some villages, feuds were settled on the field. Instead of festering in silence, neighbours would let off steam with a well-timed tackle or a thump disguised as good sportsmanship. Better a bruised shin than a decade of awkward glances across the barley fields. There were even tales quietly whispered over mugs of warm ale, of miraculous football diplomacy, In the Welsh borderlands, two rival parishes once agreed to a match instead of open war. The priests, ever pragmatic, blessed both teams and then promptly hid behind stone walls. The villagers released their fury upon the pig bladder instead of each other. After only 7 hours, 9 dislocated shoulders, and 1 minor barn fire, the match ended in a muddy tie and a shared roast to celebrate. Peace was achieved, if only temporarily, with grass stains and sweaty camaraderie. Underneath the howling and hooting, there was something magical. Mob football reminded folks that silliness and survival could go hand in hand. That even in dark times of plague and tax collectors, you could still chase a bladder across a field with 70 of your closest barely acquaintances and call it joy. Eventually, authorities became better at enforcing bans, and villages opted for quieter pursuits or better armour. Mob football faded like a bruise into folklore. But in those drowsy corners of England, where the earth still remembers how it trembled with laughter and leaping feet, the spirit of mob football lingers. Not on a rule book, but in the air itself, like the echo of a happy shout carried on the breeze. And now, as twilight settles over that muddy meadow of memory, our feet feel the soft hush of night approaching. The clamour of the crowd grows distant, folding into the sleepy silence of woven hedges and crooked fences. But just around the bend, another peculiar pastime awaits. Less muddy, perhaps, but just as baffling. We'll drift there next, if your eyes can stay open. Just a little longer. Float gently now into the twilight haze of the Middle Ages, where the entertainment was loud, the beer was warm, and the concept of fan safety was optional at best. Tonight, we find ourselves nestled into the mossy embankments of a makeshift medieval arena. Perhaps it's a wooden enclosure on the outskirts of a village, or just a muddy field encircled by braying townsfolk, mugs sloshing and bets flying like goose feathers in a windstorm. Whatever the location, one thing is certain. You didn't come here for polite clapping and crocheted souvenirs. You came here for action, possibly broken bones, possibly yours. Welcome to the grand, slightly hazardous world of medieval spectator sports. We begin our tale with that darling of English rough and tumble recreation, mob football. A lovely little pastime involving entire villages competing in chaotic matches with goals set miles apart through rivers, fields, and quite possibly your grandmother's cabbage path. Rules? Not exactly. Strategy? Ambiguous. Risk of bystanders being involuntarily drafted into the game? Very high. You see, mob football didn't so much include spectators as engulf them. If you stood too close to the action, you were likely to end up in the action, chased, jostled, and perhaps mistaken for the ball itself, especially if you were lightly spherical in shape and wearing brown woolens. To the credit of the sport, it did bring communities together, often in the way two medieval oxen might be brought together, hooves thrashing, bystanders fleeing, and someone inevitably losing a shoe. Royal authorities hated it. King Edward II banned it in 1314, claiming it caused great noise in the city and led to many evils. Of course, this only made the sport more exciting for those whose idea of a balanced Sunday involved equal parts mud, mead, and mayhem. Then came the tournaments. Oh, the medieval tournament. Equal parts chivalry, spectacle, and a very large insurance liability. Knights in glittering armour charged each other with 10-foot lances at full tilt, and crowds cheered from rickety wooden stands that might collapse if a particularly heavy fan leaned backward. Again, safety, not exactly the strong suit of the era. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for errant lances to splinter too enthusiastically sending wooden shards flying toward the crowd like medieval souvenir darts. Injuries to spectators were so common, chroniclers often listed them alongside competitors in casualty counts. Imagine buying a front row seat to a sword fight and ending the day with a sword wound. Now, that's immersive theatre. But the danger wasn't always accidental. Some lords built their tournaments to dazzle and terrify. Fire-breathing dragons, sometimes. Mock battles with hundreds of participants, often. And yes, they occasionally encouraged the use of slightly dulled weapons. But we must remember, in medieval terms, dull still meant capable of removing a limb if applied with enthusiasm. And yet, people came in droves, not because they had nothing better to do, although, in fairness, there were only so many embroidery circles one could attend, but because these events blended bravery with theatre and chaos with routine. For spectators, it was a fascinating paradox. Watching knights in shining armour uphold ideals of honour and valour, while awkwardly trying to shield oneself behind a hay bale when a jousting pole went rogue. Even spiritual events weren't safe havens from the madness of fandom. Miracle plays and mystery pageants, often staged outdoors in cramped town squares, occasionally turned rowdy, especially with the help of a few jugs of ale and some theological disagreements that escalated faster than a duck chase in mating season. Now, if you're wondering about official rules or oversight, perhaps a medieval version of stadium security, well, let's just say the job of honest referee was often left to whoever looked the least drunk and most threatening with a stick. Yet through all the splinters, the sprained ankles, and the frequent impromptu sword fights in the third row, one thing remained constant: the medieval love of spectacle. Life was hard, work was harder. But sport, even the brutal, chaotic, body-flinging kind, was a joyful release. It may have given you a headache or a hasty concussion, but it also gave you stories to tell until the next harvest moon. So as we tuck our fascination under a soft woolen blanket and leave behind the thundering crowds and the echo of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth, let us drift onward, towards quieter games, more refined entertainments, and perhaps a little canine chaos. By the light of an imagined torch, flickering against stone walls lost to time, let us drift toward a quieter corner of medieval recreation, somewhere beyond the raucous cries of the mob at a boisterous joust, and far from the muddy chaos of village football. There sat two noblemen, embroidered sleeves rolled delicately to the wrist, brows furrowed, fingers poised above carved ivory. The sport, chess, or at least what passed for chess in the later Middle Ages, equal parts intellect, diplomacy, and, occasionally, a truly ill-advised sword fight. Yes, dear dreamer, believe it or not, even the game of kings, our beloved chess, could spiral into threats, duels, and dramatically overturn tables. Let us step gently into the candlelit chambers of a 14th century lord's castle for a moment. The hearth, crackling softly with the scent of peat smoke, warms the air. Velvet draperies muffle the wind howling against the stone. Two courtiers sit opposite each other, contemplating a chessboard built from imported wood, ebony and boxwood polished to a sheen. The knight moves decisively. The bishop advances with solemn grace. A pawn, humble and expendable, steps forward into danger. It all seems so peaceful, doesn't it? And yet, scribbled inside cramped marginalia and whispered in courtly rumour, lie stories of proud tempers and the occasional blood spilled over a rook. One particularly vivid example can be found in the ill-fated match between two Spanish nobles in the early 14th century. The chronicles delicately refer to them as gentilhombres of passionate constitution. The gameplay began civilly enough. However, as one knight was taken rather carelessly, and a queen fell victim to a clumsy but legal move, voices raised, perhaps some wine was involved, certainly too many egos. What should have been an elegant pastime devolved into a sharp exchange of words, the sudden clatter of a goblet, and, tragically, a duel in the courtyard before supper. One participant survived, but his ability to castle kingside ever again was left somewhat hindered. Chess wasn't always the serene, silent game we imagine. The medieval variant was more theatrical, and the pieces themselves sometimes bore striking designs. Small figurines of knights with lances, castles with battlements, even queens with implausibly large headdresses. These sets weren't just for play, they were statements of prestige. Displaying a chess set made from walrus ivory or rock crystal was tantamount to saying, "I am literate in Latin and I bathe more than twice a year." The game was often accompanied by spectators, especially in noble courts, where leisure activities were as much about being seen as being entertained. A particularly well-played game might be commemorated in verse, or inspire a miniature painting in the margins of a prayer book. Woe to the knight who blundered too obviously. He might be the subject of courtly jests for months, and from time to time, the tension spilled beyond the board. In 1283, King Alfonso VI of Castile codified a collection of games into a sumptuous manuscript called Libro de los Juegos, the Book of Games. Within its glittering pages lie richly illustrated chess matches, backgammon boards, and even a game where you race elephants in your imagination. Yet even this scholarly collection hints at the seriousness with which these games were taken. According to its guidance, there were expectations of honor, composure, and noble conduct. Rules which, as we've seen, didn't always survive the final checkmate. Still, most matches ended peacefully, their participants likely retiring to warmed wine and gentle lute music. But the knowledge lingered. Chess, like all things in the medieval world, could still carry a hidden sword beneath its delicate robes. And isn't that the curious dance of the age? A world of clashing contradictions. Brutal yet poetic, refined yet rash. Where a knight might quote Ovid by torchlight and then throw a wheel of cheese at someone's head by mid-morning. Tonight, we leave that candlelit chamber with its tension cooled and the chessboard reset. The walls hum with silence, and the moon traipses lazily behind cloud-ragged sky. Let's draw our cloaks tighter, for we've only one tale left to tell. And so, the sun sets once again behind the stone towers of medieval Europe, casting long, sleepy shadows over fields that once echoed with cheers, groans, and the occasional chicken cluck of a sports referee. Tonight, dear dozing traveller, we tie up the laces on our parchment shoes and draw the curtain on a world where play was a little less foul and a lot more. Oh no, did he lose a finger? Let's linger gently in the twilight of these historical games. The scoreboards, such as they were, flat stones with tally marks scratched in them, are quiet now. The bloodied snow has melted. The sheep have wandered back onto the turf, and the knights, peasants, and winded monks have all returned to their cottages, cloisters, and cozy piles of hay. Strange, isn't it? How something as innocent as sport could be so very serious, and so very, very muddy. Take, for instance, the grand old tournament. Not just a joust, but a festival of encrusted egos and rattling breastplates. These events were less like modern Olympic Games and more like a county-wide excuse to hit someone with a stick in front of women. And yet, highborn lords trained their entire lives for a moment's charge on horseback, a moment of glory, or of being casually unsaddled into a hedgerow. A certain Sir Geoffrey de Malbouche, whose name roughly translates to Geoffrey of the Bad Mouth, once charged valiantly during a tournament in 1317, only to miss his opponent entirely and crash straight into a vendor cart selling eel pies. He lived to tell the tale, though the eel pies did not. But of course, not everyone could afford a suit of armour, which carries us gently back to the fields of the common folk, those noble rabble with their broken teeth and even more broken team rules. In villages across Europe, people embrace the sport of mob football, a game so loosely defined that its only consistent rules seem to be everyone runs and nobody calls their mother afterward. Mob football could take hours, sometimes days. Towns would play neighbouring towns. Sometimes a church spire was the goal, and sometimes it was just a man named Gilbert standing very still. The ball was occasionally a pig's bladder, occasionally not a ball at all. We may never know. There is a record from 1324 of a game so rowdy that it ended with 37 arrests, 2 marriages, and a goose who henceforth refused to waddle. It's unclear who won, but in a sense, didn't everyone lose? And we mustn't forget the medieval love of archery. Not quite a sport by modern standards, but for many, a relaxing pastime. Relaxing, that is, if you find it calming to be legally required to practice every Sunday or face a fine. Yes, by decree of Edward III, Englishmen were obligated to hone their longbow skills weekly, under pain of both civic disappointment and being labelled that one fellow who couldn't even shoot a hay bale. Thanks to compulsory law and the irresistible lure of outshooting your neighbour, many an archer whiled away their Sundays aiming arrows at wooden targets, straw men, and in one recorded mishap, a duck cake meant for a bake sale. The duck cake survived, barely, and then there were the quiet contests, the obscure ones, cheese rolling in alpine villages, kettle lifting among German guilds, singing competitions so competitive that one friar politely slapped another with a hymnal for going sharp in the final chorus. Even fun had rules, mostly broken ones, but between the bruises and the bannock breaks, there was also something tender. Communities gathering, not for war or sermons, but for glorious, chaotic sport. Bonfires warming winter tournaments, garlands tossed to muddy champions, laughter echoing across misty moors while someone limped home dramatically shouting, "It's just a flesh wound." And isn't that just so very human? Across centuries, whether garbed in chainmail or in potato sack trousers, people craved the same things: a challenge, a laugh, and perhaps a warm bowl of something stewed afterward. So as you drift now, wrapped up in your own quiet night, carry with you the distant sound of hooves on frosted turf, the whistle of arrows through fog, the raucous joy of a crowd cheering because someone kicked a leather pouch into someone else's front door, which apparently counted as a goal. Let the torchlight of the past dim softly in its iron sconce. Let the joust end, the pies cool, and the old helmets rest on wooden pegs. You've walked through centuries of sweat, slapstick, and sport, and now it is time to stretch out, far from the clamour. The game, dear listener, is finally at rest, and so too are you. Good night.